The Dark Scrolls. Even before she learned to read the elaborate letters of her name, the girl destined for a crown understood that she was different. In the candlelit hush of the royal nursery, she was told again and again that she carried the fortune of the realm in her small, frail body. Servants spoke in whispers as they bathed her. Older women who had seen too many generations come and go crossed themselves when they looked at her sleeping face. It was not love that made them so cautious. It was dread. They said that on the night she was born, the palace chapel's lamps sputtered and went dark, though the air was calm. The midwives claimed the queen's final breath had sounded like a question no one could answer. Some claimed the king himself, standing in the shadows, did not weep, but simply stared at the infant as if she were an intruder. Her early years were ruled by a ritualized routine designed to keep her spotless, educated, and, above all, hidden from anything common. Each dawn began with the recitation of prayers in the little oratory adjoining her chamber. She would kneel on the cold stone floor, reciting Latin phrases she barely understood while her nurses stood behind her in silence. Afterward, she was bathed in rosewater, her hair combed until her scalp stung. Then came lessons in heraldry, the genealogies of every noble house in the kingdom, the correct way to incline her head when addressed by foreign envoys. She thought this was the only life the world contained. Polished floors that reflected the candlelight, the soft lisp of courtly speech, the weight of 1,000 invisible expectations pressing down on her slender shoulders. Her father, the king, did not often appear in these first years, but when he did, the entire household seemed to hold its breath. He was a tall man still, though his limbs were gaunt with age and the long campaigns that had emptied the treasury. His eyes were dark and deep-set, and when he looked at her, she felt a strange mixture of fear and longing, like standing too near the edge of a cliff. At first, she loved those visits. Any child would. He brought gifts, a carved wooden horse, a necklace of amber beads, and sometimes he would lift her into his arms and murmur that she was his solace in an ungrateful world. He never called her by her name, only my little consolation. In time, as she grew older, the visits became longer. He would ask her to sit beside him while he dictated letters to foreign courts. He showed her seals and signet rings, explaining how a kingdom's fate could be decided by the turn of a phrase. On evenings when he lingered past dusk, he sometimes asked the servants to bring wine and dismiss themselves. He would speak of her mother then, in a low voice. He never spoke of the queen who had replaced her, the woman she called stepmother. The first time he pressed a kiss to her hair in that private darkness, she felt a confusion so profound it almost felt like falling asleep. She told herself that this was what it meant to be royal, that closeness and coldness were two halves of the same coin. On her 13th birthday, the court arranged a celebration in the great hall. Tapestries embroidered with her ancestors' victories hung from the rafters. 1,000 candles blazed along the tables, and musicians played ballads praising her innocence and beauty. She wore a gown of ivory damask, sewn with seed pearls, so heavy she could hardly walk. At the king's command, she took her place at the high table beside him, and as she looked across the rows of nobles bowing their heads, she felt for the first time the full weight of being both symbol and sacrifice. It was later that evening, when the guests had retreated to their chambers and the music had dwindled to a hush, that he asked her to stay. She obeyed without question. In the flickering lamplight, he poured wine into a goblet etched with the royal crest and set it in her hands. She had never drunk wine before. Its sweetness made her throat burn. "I am an old man," he said after a long silence. "When you are queen, they will say I squandered the kingdom. Let them. All that matters is that you are the last true vessel of our line." She did not understand what he meant, but she nodded dutifully. She was so tired she thought she might weep. When he reached to touch her cheek, she closed her eyes. That winter, a new nurse arrived from the northern provinces. She was a severe woman with pale eyes and a voice like splintered ice. She did not gossip as the others did. She did not allow the servants to speak in half-truths or to veil uncomfortable realities in euphemism. "Your Majesty," she said to the king one evening when he came to bid the girl good night, "the child is nearly a woman now. You must permit her to have proper instruction in the modesty required of her station." The king's face did not change. He dismissed the nurse with a flick of his hand. The next morning, the woman placed a carved crucifix on the girl's pillow and whispered that the Virgin's mercy was always near if one asked for it. But she would not say what she thought the girl needed mercy for. By the time her betrothal was arranged to the Prince of the Western Marches, the girl was 14. She had grown tall, her hair falling in heavy braids down her back, her eyes dark and watchful. The engagement was hailed as the salvation of two struggling dynasties. Couriers galloped through every town proclaiming the alliance. Merchants offered prayers in the cathedral. The people, weary of taxes and war, allowed themselves a fragile hope that the marriage would bring peace. When the prince arrived with his entourage, he was not much older than she, 17 perhaps, with a solemn, courteous manner. He bowed over her hand and spoke of the future in tones so careful it was clear he too was a hostage to expectation. For a few weeks there was a semblance of happiness. They dined together under the watchful gaze of courtiers. She was shown the suite of rooms she would occupy once she was married. At night she lay awake imagining the life she might have, a life that did not revolve around her father's gaze. But then came the fever. It began in the servants' quarters, a rash of sudden chills and weakness that spread through the palace like spilled ink. Within days, half the prince's retinue was ill. He himself fell sick, and though he survived, his advisers insisted he must depart to protect his claim. When he left, he pressed her hand once more. There was an apology in his eyes, but no promise he would return. She never saw him again. It was in the hollow weeks that followed, when the tapestries were taken down for fumigation and the great hall stood empty, that the king came to her more often. He never spoke of the prince. He never spoke of marriage. In those dim chambers, as the wind pressed against the window panes and the corridors echoed with the footsteps of servants carrying away the sick, something shifted irreversibly. She began to understand what the northern nurse had tried to warn her about. But it was too late. When she first realized she was carrying a child, she told no one. She told herself it was impossible, that she had misunderstood. But the signs came, inexorable as the turning seasons. The night she finally confessed to her nurse, she expected rage or disbelief. Instead, the woman sank to her knees and began to pray. The court physicians were summoned in secret. They examined her by lamplight and left without meeting her eyes. Afterward, the king came to her chamber. She remembered the way he closed the door, the way his hand lingered on the latch. "You must trust that I will protect you," he said softly. "No one will ever harm you. No one will ever take you from me." She said nothing. In her heart, something was already dying. Rumors were as old as the palace itself, but never had they spread so quickly or with such venom. In the early mornings, when the frost still clung to the window lattices and the torches along the battlements sputtered against the wind, servants gathered in corners to trade fragments of speculation in voices thin with dread. The girl was no longer merely a curiosity to them. She had become an omen. It was the king's chamberlain, a severe man whose hair had gone white in his service, who first attempted to contain the scandal. He ordered the midwives and the household physicians confined in guarded rooms. He threatened imprisonment, ruin, even the pyre for anyone who dared to speak of what they had witnessed in the girl's apartments. But it was no use. Even the threat of royal wrath could not throttle a secret so monstrous. At dawn on the feast of St. Agnes, a delegation from the cathedral arrived unannounced. The archbishop himself stood among them, his robes heavy with embroidery, his thin mouth set in a line of disapproval. Though he addressed the king with all outward courtesy, there was no mistaking the censure in his gaze. "Majesty," he said, his voice echoing across the marble floor, "there are matters that cannot be concealed behind velvet drapes. If the people suspect that your house is polluted by such sin, no amount of gold or steel will keep their loyalty." The king's expression did not flicker. He remained seated on the throne dais, one hand resting on the gilded armrest, the other hidden in the folds of his cloak. He did not so much as look toward his daughter, who stood beside the throne with her eyes lowered to the floor. "It is a lie," he said calmly, "a fabrication invented by those who would weaken the crown." The archbishop inclined his head in acknowledgment, but did not retreat. Lies can be dangerous when they resemble truth too closely. That was the beginning of the rift. In the weeks that followed, the kingdom's uneasy peace began to unravel. Nobles who had once pledged undying loyalty now sent guarded letters to neighboring courts, weighing whether it was wiser to remain or to defect. In the southern marches, where the king's authority had always been tenuous, the barons began to raise private levies, citing the moral decay of the royal household as justification. The girl, soon to be called queen, though no one dared speak the title aloud, felt the change most acutely in the way people looked at her. Where once there had been polite deference, there was now something brittle and unsteady. Even the servants who continued to attend her did so with the caution of people who suspected they were tending to a living curse. At night she dreamed of corridors that never ended, their walls hung with tapestries depicting mothers devouring their children. She dreamed of the prince who had left her behind, standing in a field of black flowers, his mouth moving in silent accusation. When she woke, it was always in darkness. The windows had been shuttered and barred on the king's orders. "You must not let them see you," he told her one evening as he stood at the foot of her bed, his face pale with fatigue. "They are waiting for any sign of weakness." She wanted to ask what strength remained to her, but she was too tired to argue. When the boy was born, the king insisted he be kept in the old nursery suite, watched over by guards sworn to secrecy. He named the child as the orphaned heir of a dead cousin, an invention so transparent it fooled no one. Whispers multiplied like flies. The queen, her stepmother, had long since retreated to a convent in the north. Officially, she was there to recover from an illness. In truth, no one believed she would return. She sent no letters. The archbishop, thwarted in his first attempt to force a confession, convened a council of bishops to deliberate on whether the king's conduct merited excommunication. Some of the clergy hesitated. To condemn the sovereign was to risk tearing the country in two. But there were others, young men with newly minted mitres, determined to prove their virtue, who spoke passionately of the need to purify the throne. Meanwhile, the girl remained in her rooms, cut off from the few companions she had ever known. The northern nurse, who had once placed a crucifix on her pillow, was gone, banished to an abbey. Her chambermaids were replaced by strangers who never met her gaze. In her solitude, she began to write in secret. Small scraps of parchment hidden behind the wainscoting, covered in a cramped hand that blurred whenever her tears fell. She did not know what she hoped to accomplish. Perhaps she thought that if she recorded the truth, some future generation would understand that she had not been complicit, that she had never asked for any of it. Sometimes she wrote the same sentence over and over. "I did not choose this." When spring came at last, it brought no relief. If anything, the thaw only sharpened the kingdom's sense of betrayal. Couriers arrived from foreign courts, bearing letters that were equal parts accusation and invitation. Should any baron or bishop wish to renounce allegiance, they would find welcome across the border. The king responded by ordering new taxes, ostensibly to fortify the frontiers. In reality, it was to fund the ever-growing apparatus of secrecy and repression. His counselors began to desert him, quietly resigning their posts and departing under cover of darkness. One evening, as dusk bled into night, he came to her chamber again. He looked older than she had ever seen him, his hands trembling where they rested on the carved door frame. "They will not take you," he said without preamble. His voice was ragged, stripped of its accustomed arrogance. "Whatever they threaten, you are mine." She did not answer. She sat at her writing desk, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She had discovered a terrible clarity in those months of isolation. Whatever else was stolen from her, she could still choose whether or not to meet his gaze. When he realized she would not look at him, something in him seemed to fracture. He turned and left without another word. In the weeks that followed, he withdrew almost entirely from the affairs of state. Petitions went unanswered, edicts were delayed, ambassadors waited in vain for an audience. Into that void stepped the archbishop and the council of bishops. They sent emissaries to every province, proclaiming that the church could no longer support a sovereign who profaned both God's law and natural decency. In a lesser kingdom, perhaps such proclamations would have been ignored. But this was a land already fraying at every seam. The southern barons declared open rebellion, raising the banners of a pretender, a cousin whose claim to the throne had once been laughable. Now he was a rallying point for every grievance: the taxes, the wars, the rumors of incest. Even the northern provinces, long loyal to the king, began to waver. Bishops there spoke of an anointed line that had become diseased, that must be cut away to save the body of the realm. Through it all, she remained confined. Some days she wondered if she had become a living relic, an object of horror and fascination that no one dared destroy outright. One morning, a priest she did not recognize was ushered into her chamber. He was young, with a solemn face and ink-stained fingers. He carried a leather-bound ledger and a quill. "My lady," he said softly, "the council requires your testimony." Her throat closed. For a moment, she could not speak. "What testimony?" she whispered. "They require you to confirm or deny certain allegations." He did not look up from the ledger. It struck her then that whatever hope she had of escaping the past had vanished. Even her silence was no refuge. She drew a slow breath. "If I tell you what you wish to hear, will that absolve me?" He hesitated. The pause was answer enough. The priest did not answer her question. Instead, he dipped his quill in ink and began to write, recording every detail of the moment: her pallor, the tremor in her voice, the way her hands clenched around the folds of her gown. She closed her eyes. For an instant, she thought she could still feel the child in her arms, though the boy was locked away in another wing of the palace, guarded as if he were both treasure and contagion. When she opened her eyes, the priest was watching her, some small, hesitant compassion breaking through the mask of official detachment. "My lady," he began again, more gently this time, "the church is prepared to be merciful if you will only confirm that you were forced." A brittle laugh escaped her. Forced, as if there had ever been a choice, as if the king's shadow had not covered her since her birth. "I am tired," she whispered, her voice so thin she wondered if he could hear her at all. "Come back tomorrow." She turned her face away toward the shuttered window. He bowed his head and withdrew. After he left, she sat motionless for a long time. The candle burned low, throwing her silhouette in wavering relief against the wall. In that uncertain glow, she no longer looked like a queen or a daughter or a mother, only a figure hollowed out by dread. Downstairs, the great hall had been transformed into a war room. Maps were unrolled across the banquet tables. Messengers arrived hourly, each bearing worse news than the last. The rebel armies were converging. 3 baronies had already declared allegiance to the pretender. In the east, a rival bishop had proclaimed that the true queen had been defiled beyond redemption, and that any who defended her were accomplices in her father's sin. One evening, as the wind moaned in the chimneys and the torches flickered against the tapestries, the king summoned what remained of his council. They gathered in a crescent before the dais, their faces lined with fatigue. The chamberlain spoke first, his voice carefully neutral. "Majesty, the treasury is exhausted. We cannot pay the mercenaries much longer." "Then find more coin," the king replied without looking up. His gaze remained fixed on the blank expanse of the far wall. "There is no more," the chamberlain said quietly. "Not unless we raise the levy again." At that, a murmur rippled through the assembled men, one part fear, one part disbelief. They all knew what further taxes would mean: riots in the cities, defections among the lesser lords, perhaps even an uprising within the palace itself. The king raised a hand for silence. "They will not rise," he said flatly. "They do not dare." But in truth, everyone could see he no longer believed it. Later that night, after the council dispersed in uneasy silence, he walked alone through the corridors. Servants flattened themselves against the walls as he passed. Some claimed that in those hours he spoke aloud to the darkness, addressing phantoms no one else could see. In her locked chamber, the girl, she could no longer think of herself as anything but that, despite the crown they intended to place upon her head, lay awake listening to the muffled echoes of his footsteps. Once she would have felt a sick relief that he still came to her door, that he had not abandoned her to the cold machinery of the church's judgment. Now she felt only exhaustion, a bone-deep certainty that whatever happened next, it would not bring peace. At dawn, a delegation of clergy arrived to deliver their ultimatum. They were led by the archbishop himself, robed in white as if attending a funeral. "You have 1 day," he told the king in a voice that carried through every chamber. "Either you abdicate and submit to penance, or we will declare your reign illegitimate. The people will be absolved of their oaths." The king did not reply. When the archbishop turned to leave, the girl thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not triumph exactly, but the weary conviction of a man who had resigned himself to tragedy. After they were gone, silence fell over the palace so profound it seemed the building itself was holding its breath. That night she dreamed she stood in the cathedral. Every pillar was draped in black. The walls wept streams of dark water, and the choir sang a dirge in a language she did not understand. When she woke, the candle had guttered out. In the darkness, she heard footsteps approaching, slow, deliberate, familiar. The door creaked open. She did not turn to look. "My little consolation," the king's voice murmured, softer than she had ever heard it. "You must understand, I did everything for you." She closed her eyes, willing herself not to speak. He crossed the chamber and rested his hand on her shoulder. Even through the fabric of her gown, the contact made her flinch. "There is nothing left," he said after a long moment. His hand fell away. "They will take everything. They will call you unclean. They will destroy our name." Her voice emerged as a whisper. "Then let them." He drew in a sharp breath. The silence that followed felt longer than any night she had ever endured. When he finally spoke, there was no anger in it, only a desolate certainty. "You were always stronger than I," he said. Then he turned and left her alone. By morning, the palace was in uproar. The king had vanished. Some said he had fled to the coast to seek passage abroad. Others believed he had taken refuge in one of the old hunting lodges deep in the northern forests. There were darker rumors, too, that he had ended his life rather than face the spectacle of deposition. It scarcely mattered anymore. With his disappearance, the last barrier crumbled. At noon, the archbishop returned. This time, no emissaries accompanied him. He brought only a parchment scroll, unrolled before her as she sat unmoving in the chair by the hearth. "Your Majesty," he said, though she knew the title was a courtesy now, an echo of something already lost. By the authority of the Holy See, you are to be placed in protective seclusion pending further judgment. Your child will be taken into the care of the church." She stared at the flickering fire. "I will not resist," she said, her voice as calm as if discussing the weather. Perhaps that, more than anything, unnerved him. He gestured to the priest behind him, the young man with the ink-stained fingers. "If you wish to record any testament, now is the time." She thought of the scraps of parchment hidden in the wainscoting, the confessions she had written in the small hours, the words she had once believed might absolve her. Slowly, she shook her head. "No more words," she said. And so the ledger remained blank. They led her through the corridors where she had once walked in procession, trailing silks and perfumed petals. Now there was no music, no applause, only the echo of her steps and the faint rustle of her plain gray gown. At the gates she turned once, looking back at the towers silhouetted against the paling sky. For an instant she thought she saw a figure watching from an upper window, a tall shadow she could not name. Then she lowered her eyes and stepped into the waiting carriage. The road away from the palace was nothing like she remembered it. Once, as a child, she had traveled this same route in a carriage lined with brocade, peering through embroidered curtains at the villages that passed like so many painted miniatures. Then every milestone had felt like a promise, a wider world waiting beyond the walls of her confinement. Now there were no curtains. The carriage was plain wood, fitted with iron locks on the doors and narrow slits for air. She did not protest when they closed it. She only folded her hands in her lap and fixed her gaze on the worn planks of the floor. They traveled through the night, the wheels grumbling over frozen ruts. At dawn, when the carriage jolted to a halt, she did not ask where they were. She had stopped thinking of the future as a place she might reach. The priest, the young one who had first asked for her confession, was there to help her down. He did not meet her eyes as he guided her toward the heavy doors of the convent. "This is the house of St. Bridget," he said softly, as if reciting from a catechism. "You will be safe here." Safe. The word sounded as thin and brittle as old parchment. She did not reply. Inside the convent was a hushed warren of corridors and cells, each more sparsely furnished than the last. The Mother Superior was a narrow woman with a face carved in lines of perpetual disappointment. She bowed just enough to acknowledge the former queen's status, but did not pretend to welcome her. "You will have a cell of your own," she said, her voice dry as dust. "You will attend chapel daily and take no visitors without my consent." "And the child?" she heard herself ask. The Mother Superior paused, her mouth tightening. "He has been conveyed to the cathedral orphanage," she said after a moment. "It is not fitting that he remain in your care." A hollow ache opened in her chest. She had known this was coming, yet the words still struck with the force of a hammer. "I understand," she whispered. A novice led her to her cell, a narrow chamber with a single pallet, a crucifix on the wall, and a tiny barred window that looked onto nothing but sky. As the door closed behind her, she felt something unravel at last, the final fragile strand of hope she had clung to without even realizing. In the weeks that followed, she spoke little. The nuns left food outside her door and retrieved the empty bowls without comment. She obeyed the schedule without complaint. Matins at dawn, silent prayer at noon, Compline in the blue dusk. Her body moved through the motions, but her thoughts drifted in restless, bitter circles. Sometimes she wondered whether her father still lived. No word of him reached the convent. No proclamation was issued confirming his death or exile. In the absence of certainty, rumor grew in every direction. One rumor said he had fled to a distant court, selling the last of his honor in exchange for sanctuary. Another claimed he had drowned himself in the river that wound through the northern forests. There were even those who insisted he had taken holy orders under a false name, seeking absolution in a monastery no one could locate. She could not say which story she preferred. Perhaps none of them. Perhaps it was easier to imagine him simply gone, unmoored from time and consequence. When sleep finally came to her, it was thick with dreams. The boy's face, unformed and shifting, the feel of her father's hand resting on her shoulder, the cold hush of the cathedral where she would never kneel as queen. Months passed. The seasons turned. She marked them only by the changing patterns of light on the stone floor. One morning, the Mother Superior appeared at her cell door, flanked by two unfamiliar priests. "You are to be moved," she announced, her tone clipped. "Moved?" she repeated dully. "The council has determined that your presence here creates too much disquiet." The word made her want to laugh, as if disquiet were something that could be contained by walls. They gave her no time to gather her few belongings. She followed them down the corridor without protest. Outside, a carriage waited, this one even plainer than the last, the horses already restive in the pale dawn light. As they guided her up the step, she glanced over her shoulder. A small group of nuns stood watching from the cloister arcade, their faces unreadable. She wondered if any of them would remember her when they were old, if they would tell novices of the silent woman who had once been a queen. The journey was longer this time. Days blurred into nights. Once, when they stopped to change horses, she heard a distant peal of bells and realized it must be Easter. The realization felt almost absurd. Time was still moving in the world beyond her confinement, though it had ceased to mean anything to her. When at last the carriage halted, she did not bother to ask where they had brought her. It scarcely mattered. The priest led her into a fortress-like building, part monastery, part prison. The walls were thick as a man's height, the windows no more than slits. This, they informed her in measured tones, would be her final place of seclusion. They left her in a cell much like the last, though here even the crucifix was absent. Only a plain bench and a straw pallet remained to suggest any human presence. After the door closed, she sat for a long while, her hands resting limply in her lap. This, she thought, is how legends begin. A woman in a tower, a child hidden from the world, a kingdom that rotted from within because no one dared name what had poisoned it. If she closed her eyes, she could almost hear the stories they would one day tell, that she had been a witch, or a seductress, or a madwoman. Anything to make sense of the fact that an entire realm had unraveled around her. In truth, she was none of those things, only a girl who had never been allowed to grow into anything else. Years passed. She marked them by the slow decay of her body, the ache in her joints each winter, the way her hair grew thin and white. Sometimes a priest came to hear her confession, but she had nothing left to confess. Her silence had become her only possession. Once, in a summer so hot the mortar in the walls began to crumble, she asked the guard whether he had ever seen the boy. He looked at her with something like pity. "They say he is being educated by the cathedral canons," he said. "They say he is clever." She did not ask anything more. She knew better than to hope that cleverness would spare him the burden of his birth. On the anniversary of her confinement, she permitted herself to write a single letter. Not to the church, not to any surviving noble, to the child she would never see again. "I am sorry," she wrote, the quill trembling in her grasp. "I am sorry for everything I could not protect you from. I am sorry for the name you must carry. I am sorry you were born into a story written long before you drew breath." She folded the letter and sealed it with wax. She did not know whether it would ever reach him. Perhaps that was for the best. When winter came again, she fell ill. The physicians came and went in solemn procession, murmuring Latin prayers and measuring her pulse with cold fingers. She watched them without fear. Whatever waited beyond this life could not be more desolate than what she left behind. On the night she died, a storm rose over the fortress. The wind howled through the corridors, rattling the iron-banded doors. In the morning, the priests found her lying on her side, one hand outstretched toward the barred window. Her face was peaceful, so much so that, for a moment, they doubted she was truly gone. They buried her in an unmarked grave within the monastery grounds. No procession accompanied her. No heralds proclaimed her passing. And yet in the years that followed, her story took on a life of its own. Minstrels sang ballads of the queen who had given birth to her father's child. Chroniclers argued over whether she had been a victim or a conspirator. The church declared her memory an example of the corruption that must be purged from royal lines. In time, even her name was blurred by retelling. She became only the queen, a figure more myth than woman. A cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of power, wherever ambition grew too hungry or bloodlines too entangled. But sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, a novice in the convent of St. Bridget would dream of a pale girl standing at a barred window watching the sky, and she would wake with tears on her face, though she could not say why. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.